Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really thoughtful and fascinating conversation with the designer, researcher, and educator, Mindy Seu. Mindy is currently a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and was previously a designer at 2x4 and at MoMA's in-house design team. In her spare time, she's worked on a variety of archival projects for magazines like Avant, Garde, and Fact. Mindy and I met a few years ago when we were both living in San Francisco, and I've just really enjoyed watching the evolution of her career. And so I was really interested in talking to her about how she thinks about her work and how her work has evolved over the last couple years. So in this conversation, we talk about her early design education. We talk about how she started teaching and the role of research in her design process. We also talk about her decision to go back to school, to go to grad school at Harvard, and what she wants to get out of that, as well as how that experience is already changing her process and practice. This was a great conversation. Mindy is so thoughtful, and I felt like I really learned a lot from her and just really admire her thinking and research and work, and think that she embodies so much of these ideas around expanded practice that come up on the podcast all the time. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Mindy Seu. I have a bunch of different things that I want to talk to you about that are all very probably different and diverse, and I'm not sure exactly the best way to structure them in a coherent conversation. And so I kind of want to start with just a little bit of your background, because I don't actually know. Yeah. I've known you for a couple years now, but I don't know how you got into all of this or kind of like where your interest in design came from. And so I thought that might be a good way to kind of frame all of this, and then we can use that to talk about all of these other things.
Right.
So where'd your interest in design come from, or how did you get into graphic
I wonder
design?
how far this should go back. Should I start with high school?
Yeah, as far back as you want.
I mean, I think that is related. My mom was a fine arts major, interior design double, and my dad was an engineer. So when I was growing up, I had these two sides where my mom would take me to the park and she would make a grid out of wire and we would draw different squares.
Oh, that's amazing.
Whereas my dad was much more structured and pragmatic. And then in high school, I was involved in a bunch of these student groups, like student government or yearbook. So you're designing yearbook spreads or t-shirts or posters, but you don't think it'll be a career. You just enjoy doing this thing. So then when I went to UCLA, I was actually a business economics major.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I didn't take a single biz econ class.
Okay.
So within my first year, I was taking a bunch of foundational studios in the design media arts program. So then
and you could just do that, even though you... Okay.
Well, you would have to petition with the teacher and kind of show enthusiasm and persistence. Yeah. But once I took a bunch of those, I used that as portfolio work and then applied to transfer the next year as a sophomore. So then once I began my second year, I became a design media arts major.
What was that transition like? I mean, obviously you had this life where you kind of were aware of design and that this was a part of your world. Why? I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, why didn't you just do that originally if that was the thing?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think it's really because even if my mom was interested in the arts, she was still, when I was growing up, my parents owned a flower shop. And later now they're in real estate. But still, you don't actually know what job opportunities exist when your worldview is okay, I need technical skills. I'm going to go into business and then get an MBA.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I didn't even know it was possible. I didn't know what art direction was. I didn't know who designed fashion labels or anything like that.
Did you know, going into business, did you know, what that meant?
No. Even now, do I really know what that means?
Yeah.
I recently took a class at MIT Sloan, and even in that class, I was like, what does it actually mean to manage a company? And do these students actually care about which company they manage? Or are they just trying to get general management skills?
Right.
It's all very vague to me still. Maybe if I got an MBA and it was more specific, it might be clarified. But
so when you then switched and kind of realized that design, or like, what did you say it was that you switched?
It's a strange title. It's called Design Media Art.
Okay, what does that mean?
I don't even know, because it used to have a pipe design and then a pipe media arts. They later removed that punctuation mark. I think it's meant to be, we're very multidisciplinary.
Okay.
So the 4 different tracks are graphic design, video, gaming, interactive.
Oh, interesting.
But you can mix and match. So everyone who comes out of the program is basically like pulling skills from all these 4 different quadrants.
Oh, so you don't go in with like you're going into this program to be a graphic designer, to be a video artist.
Not at all.
You do all of them.
You have to take everything, and you can kind of specialize in your last year. But most students really do mix and match. So I gravitated towards graphic design and interactive. But still, when I graduated, I wanted to be a book designer.
Because I was going to say, hearing this actually makes sense with the way I've watched you work and the way I've seen your career move. I feel is very multidisciplinary and is very much not in, doesn't always follow kind of what we might think of as traditional graphic design.
Yeah, sure.
And so I guess I'm interested in maybe how that very multidisciplinary education influenced your career kind of graduating, or like why after all that, what was it about book design, or how did you kind of navigate that?
It's interesting because in retrospect, I have been looking through some of my older undergraduate projects thinking, wow, this was actually quite in line with what I'm doing now. So, for example, I took a class with Brian Rodinger, and it was just a book design class. I forgot what the course was called. But I basically made a book about internet semantics and language. Yeah. I was using that content as a proxy just to make this book and think about the form.
Right.
But now that I'm looking back on it, I'm like, okay, that's actually quite pointed to what I'm more interested in.
Yeah.
Graphic design will always be a pillar in my practice, but it's not like the primary focus. I'm not only concerned with form. And then for my thesis project with Casey Rees, I made like this print-on-demand catalog, so still very print-based.
Yeah.
But students could then upload their project information like seconds before our thesis show. Yeah. And then in the gallery space, people could select their projects, and it printed on the spot, and they could bind it on the spot.
Oh, interesting.
So again, very related.
Yeah.
But when you're at that age, you're just making things because you're kind of fearless and you want to make everything. Right. Now I'm much less fearless, I think, and more concerned about what I distribute publicly. It is interesting to see those threads. Yeah, I want to come back to that, because both of those things about kind of how what you were doing matches what you're doing now, and this idea of not being just interested in form, but also this fearlessness. I want to come back to both of those, but I want to just follow this kind of thread of your story, and just to kind of get us up to today. Sure. So after you graduated, you went to MoMA first? Was that your job right after? An in-house graphic design studio, or what is it called? In-house Department of Advertising and Graphic Design. But then I quickly switched to 2x4, and then when I was hired in the New York office, one of the art directors, Milena Sade, was moving to San Francisco to start their West Coast satellite. So then I moved out with her, and it was the two of us there for several years. And was that kind of very... I'm asking this question based on your last answer. Was that kind of very kind of what I would call traditional graphic design? You were working with clients, it was kind of, client work and mostly interactive kind of? The 2x4 structure is fairly siloed. I think at this point there are 6 teams. Some are duplicates, like there are multiple branding teams. But I was on the interactive media team, which basically meant, which is an interesting title actually, because even if our works were all interactive, they weren't necessarily digital, but it has that connotation. Oh, interesting. It was very spatial, hence the installation part.
That all fell under the interactive team.
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. And you do often work with architecture and branding and whatnot, but there are also projects that are specific to just single silos.
Yeah.
Right, so then when I was working with Milena, it was just the two of us in the West Coast satellite.
The reason I asked that is because, you mentioned before that you're not just interested in form, and that graphic design is just kind of one pillar of the things, of kind of all of the things that you're interested in. And I'm thinking about that I kind of came to your work, or first was introduced to you through a project that I think you did on your own. It was the Sweethearts project. That was just a kind of project you did by yourself, right?
Well, it was interesting because I was talking with a Twitter friend, and he and I wanted to work on a thing together. So we brainstormed Sweethearts and how that would translate so nicely into a digital form.
Yeah.
It naturally has a page structure. It's meant to be flipped. It's very interactive and kinetic. And then my partner at the time helped me build it. So it was kind of a collaborative project, definitely. But I ended up adopting it as kind of my brainchild because I put so much effort into this.
Right. I mean, I assigned it to my students this semester when it was a writing class, and we were talking about kind of the visual aspect of writing, and obviously concrete poetry was a part of that. And it was so much easier to show them Sweethearts through the thing that you made than actually kind of showing them the book itself. But the reason I think this is interesting and kind of connects back to everything we've talked about so far is, and I'm not trying to set you up to kind of talk negatively about your professional career or your former employers or anything, because I feel this way about my own career, that when you're interested in things that are related to graphic design but not kind of strictly graphic design, you can't always get that in your quote-unquote day job. And so you have to do these kind of side projects. Was that, I'm not trying to say were you not intellectually engaged at 2x4 or something like that, but what do you think that drive was outside of the work that you were doing day to day, that you were kind of doing these other projects?
I think the primary difference is it's the juxtaposition of both of these sides. So during your day job, when I was at 2x4, you have massive projects. Right. There's a large scope, there's a long time frame, there's high profile clients. You're working with several people, and there are multiple rounds constantly.
Right.
So you learn a lot from that process, but then to pair that with kind of this microsite where you're translating a book that you can finish in about a month, you can distribute quickly. It's just a totally different type of project. So it's not that, I think it's quite reductive to say like day jobs are corporate and private or your personal projects are what you should be doing. Because you do learn a lot from both of these things. Yeah.
Well, and that's where you stole my thunder, because that's kind of where I was trying to take this, because I wanted to then bring in that you also started teaching when you were in San Francisco, and I'm very interested in how you've done a lot of these, I'm calling them personal projects, because I don't know how else to call them, but Sweethearts, but then also these kind of archives that you've been building, and then you started teaching, and then you're doing 2x4, and I'm interested in how all those things fit together, or the overlap between them, or how you kind of thought about them as part of a larger practice that you were building.
Well, I will say at 2x4, even if you're working with incredibly smart, generous people, especially on my team, you're working with a lot of new technologies, and there are kind of these pop-up things that aren't meant to stand the test of time, so you're open to like pitching something that's quite wild, because you know it'll be down in a year or a few years. So that paired with teaching is completely different, because how do you then teach this non-client model to students? Because if you think of San Francisco and California College of the Arts, it's very informed by the culture that surrounds the school, which is startup billboards on buses flying by, the school being very expensive, Silicon Valley kind of permeating everything that they do. So it's really easy to just have a student say, I want to become very technical so I can get hired at this company. So then how do you then reveal, okay, that's totally fair and I understand the perspective, But there is something to be said for initiating your own work and seeing how that might guide your own practice, even if it is paired with a more corporate endeavor.
How did you do that? I know that's a big question. It's a question that I've been thinking about all the time as I've been doing more and more teaching, because this is a bit reductive and oversimplified, but I could bucket my students into people who are really interested, students who are really interested in kind of graphic design at a kind of intellectual, this is a way that I can kind of explore things that I'm interested in, which I think is kind of what we're kind of talking about. There are people that are like, I want to work at Google, basically, and give me the skills so I can get that job, so I can build that portfolio.
Sure. And
then there's a group of people, more so in undergrad, that are just, I want to make stuff that looks cool. Stuff that looks good on the internet that people are going to like on Instagram. That's a generalization, but I think that's kind of roughly the buckets. And so I've been thinking, how do I hit all of those and show them that, graphic design is this thing that can do this one thing, but it can also do this other thing.
I will say, I think when you're younger, it's really easy to say, this is right and this is wrong.
Yeah.
And while there are a lot of problems with Google and Apple, we still use those products.
Yeah.
And you can still work for those companies, but it's important to not just buy into their ideology and understand what you're contributing to. You can understand that Google is a monopoly and that they're selling our information, surveying us without our permission. That's fair, but you have to acknowledge that openly before just blindly joining their team. Same thing with the internet, making this aesthetically pleasing content. That's a great formal exercise too. But it's the difference between passive consumption and active consumption.
Right.
It's just knowing who your audience is and who you actually want to build a community with.
Have you read, it's so funny that you say this, I'm currently in the middle of reading a book by Neil Postman called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Do you know this book?
No.
And the whole first chapter is almost exactly what we're talking about. The book was written in the 60s, but it's so relevant to today and to this conversation in that, he's basically arguing that the goal of teaching, or the goal of the classroom, is to teach students to be critical thinkers, to be both in their tribes or communities or corporations, while also being outside just enough that they can kind of be critical of it. And I think for graphic design especially, I think that's such a great skill to teach graphic designers, because so much of graphic design is taking these kind of ideologies that you're talking about and making them manifest and putting them out in the world, making them attractive.
Right. I think we shouldn't simplify and say like mass media is inherently bad.
Right.
Or like mass public consumption is inherently shallow.
Right.
Maybe it is a majority of the time, but if you do have that outlet, what are ways that you might change how people process information?
Yeah.
I will also say, when I first started teaching, I basically inherited Laurel Schwaltz's class.
Okay.
She teaches interactive at Yale MFA, and she was I think it's called designer in residence at California College of the Arts.
Yeah.
So when I inherited her class, you basically have this like very stable foundation of these experimental conceptual projects that you can build off of and change, but it does kind of set the tone for what the course will be.
Right.
And I think that was really important for CCA.
Did you have an interest in teaching, or how did this even come about that you started?
I'd always been interested in teaching. I think maybe it's also going back to that idea of juxtapositions.
Yeah.
Like, I really love workshops because you can't overthink something.
Right.
You have like 3 hours to maybe a week to have an idea, commit to it, execute it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like perfectly conceptually sound, but it's just rapid exercises that really does help build like these different nodes and whatever your holistic practice is.
How did, when you kind of started teaching, or when you then found yourself, taking on the role of a teacher or an educator, do you feel like you approached your job differently? Did that change how you thought about the role of the designer? Like, did that kind of come back the other way?
I almost wonder if it was a natural progression, because so many people at 2x4 are teachers, including all of the founders,
right?
Including the people on my team. Yeah, I'm actually wondering right now if everyone on my old team was teaching while also working. I think the hardest part was you're still working full time, so that means you're teaching the 7 to 10 slot twice a week.
Right, yeah.
While still trying to maintain these personal projects. So that really starts wearing on you. It's really easy to say yes at the end of a semester and say like, okay, I'll deal with it in 3 months when the semester starts again. But I was starting to question like, okay, what do I want to prioritize? I can easily stay on this track and continue being a designer in a studio who teaches on the side and it would be fine. Mm-hmm. Or I can really try to define what my practice is.
It's interesting to say that possibly everyone on your team were teachers. I'm wondering if that changes the kind of design culture in a studio or even the way you approach design when there's this kind of connection to academia or to not just kind of endlessly pushing out work.
Right.
And I will lay my cards on the table. I'm asking that coming from work environments where there was no connection to academia, and that often the environment was just, we just have to be putting stuff out all the time. And so there wasn't a place for that kind of reflection or critique that we're kind of talking about. And I'm curious if that's ingrained in a studio culture. Do you think that changes the output or the process or the discussion?
From a purely logistical standpoint, it means they're more forgiving when you need to teach.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because at the end of the day, you only have a set amount of hours.
Yeah.
So if they understand that you're teaching, then they are supportive of that and they want you to explore these other endeavors. On the other hand, you might consider the 2x4 model also kind of a teaching structure. Maybe when I was there, it was kind of past that point, but when 2x4 started, it was rather small.
Right.
And it was meant to be like this learning environment.
Right.
It's a much, much larger scale now, so I'm actually curious how much of that is maintained.
Yeah.
But I think that foundation is there.
So you had, from the outside, what appears like a good job at 2x4. You were teaching. You had a very prolific output of side projects or personal projects. And then last year you decided to go back to school and go to graduate school at Harvard. And so why did you do that? Or like, what was the plan? Or what weren't you getting from this kind of practice you were building for yourself that you...
Like, I wanted the criticism, the reading, the writing, the theory, and the research. You have a sort of research at 2x4, and obviously that applies to teaching as well. It's not like the primary focus. It does remind me of this amazing woman, Eros Rogoff. She's the director of visual culture at Goldsmiths.
Okay.
I went to her lecture at MIT's Art Culture Technology program, and she talked about becoming research and how currently we might describe it as project-based research. You have all of these different projects, but they all are culminating in like a singular research thread. And while I was learning from good people and working with great clients and using that tech, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, I felt like, okay, I don't know if I want to keep promoting other people's brands or institutions. I want to like try to work with nonprofits. They really think about the interface, really think about digital archives. And I moved like really deeply into web culture. And maybe away from spatial installation.
So what was your first year like? Do you feel like that thing that you were going for, or that kind of maybe shifting how you thought about your work, do you feel like you're closer to that, or that you were able to better put words around it or define it?
I think so, definitely. I should specify that Harvard's Graduate School of Design, especially my concentration, which is called Art Design in the Public Domain, it's post-professional. The name itself is quite leading. There is no curriculum, so you have to initiate your entire course load, who advises you, who you want to collaborate with, and what supplemental institutions you'd like to work with. I'll also mention that the name institutions gets a bad rap, like it's kind of used in this negative connotation.
What do you mean?
If you think of like institutional critique, or for example, it's really easy to say that institutions are like the man and you should which is again very reductive.
Yeah.
But if you just think about the pure definition, an institution is just a grouping of people who have a shared vision. So I kind of, maybe it's stripping it down too much, but I do like to think about it in that way. Because even like a body of 3 could be considered a sort of institution, right? What are ways to think of like organizing people?
I want to go back to kind of what you were talking about with, what was the name of the program again?
Art, design, the public domain.
Art, design, and the public domain, or in the public domain? And. So I might be stretching this connection, but I'm interested in how that reflects back or connects back to what you were saying earlier about graphic design being just kind of one pillar of the thing that you're interested in, and that form making isn't the only thing that you're interested in, and kind of hearing you talking about institutions and institutional critique and kind of moving your practice away from promoting kind of other brands or other companies. I'm wondering how all these things fit together, if they do.
I think if you ask me in a year, I will have a much more clear answer for you. I do think that these are like core components of what I'm thinking about. If I use like digital archive, which is my primary focus, as kind of a proxy to talk about all those things, how can you use this existing standard, like skeuomorphism, reading online, things like that, and kind of change them for what you think is a better practice? So all these projects I kind of see as case studies for how I want to view information online. And that is making it as comprehensive as possible, making it free and accessible, connecting a lot of different references and writers and contexts. How can we think about the interface as a place of like discursion rather than display? Currently, the internet is all about display and self-promotion, and I think that is difficult to like find your place in.
I guess if I were, this is such a oversimplified question, but I don't know how else to ask it. What is the role of the designer in that, I guess? Or how do you think about your role as a designer, and as a designer who's thinking about these things in a very kind of expansive way of changing these methodologies or these modes of communication? How can or how should design, quote unquote design, play a role in that?
Let me use a metaphor to maybe describe this.
All right, yeah.
I don't know if it will be successful. When I first got to the graduate school of design, it's an architecture school, so everyone was a designer or used that title, but they were architects. They weren't allowed to use the word architect because they didn't have a license, so they called themselves designers.
Oh, interesting.
So me, as a graphic designer, going into that program, hearing about people being designers and designing, I had to really question the semantics of the world that I was in.
Right.
So now I do kind of feel like maybe these titles are within your world way too narrow, and we shouldn't really... Yes, I call myself a designer, but I don't necessarily think that's limited to form or development or...
I didn't mean to keep coming back to this idea of design being this one pillar because you weren't just interested in form. I'm wondering if our definitions of what a graphic designer or even just a designer in general is too limiting or is too strict. And something I feel like this podcast has kind of become a question of what is graphic design, or what else could graphic design be, or how else could we talk about graphic design? And so I'm wondering what your experience, with that word maybe, or with that term, and as your practice has expanded, and then working with architects who are calling themselves designers and kind of changing how you think about this word, like where are you now with that, or like your relationship to that term? How do you feel about that?
Not to dance around the actual word designer, but I will say it's really interesting redefining these terms, but I think it's more important to just think of yourself as a constructed subject. So you have all of these experiences in your life. We go to school, we study graphic design, but our parents also did something. and they came from certain places.
Right.
And like we all have these rich histories. So if we can weave that all together and then make work from it and think about the audience, then maybe the term doesn't actually matter.
I mean, I agree. I agree with that. And I've often wrestled with terms and what I call myself and what I call my work. And part of me kind of thinks like what you're talking about makes sense. And I've thought this also that, it doesn't really matter. But then part of me also, and maybe this is just because it's what I studied, because it's like the thing that I've always wanted to do, still finds value in that word designer or that term graphic designer, and that I want to redefine it or open it up.
Right. Maybe another way to look at it is maybe some people's practices are quite singular.
Yeah.
But for me, collaboration is a huge part of all the projects that I want to make and all the things that I want to research. So maybe a nicer way to think about it is the title designer helps you kind of delegate roles when you're collaborating with different types of people. So when I'm working with an archivist or an educator or an activist, my title can be designer, that's fine, but you still have a discussion and you each come in with different skills. But the end project is a holistic project. It's not like they're thinking of the subject and I'm just reskinning it.
So I know this is premature to ask this question since you're only it is a 2-year program?
Right.
So you're only halfway through, but what are you thinking is next? Or how do you see your life post-grad school different than pre-grad school?
This is again going to evade the question.
Okay.
But I would say in my life, I've always been like a 5-year planner, right? I have an idea, I create this rough 5-year plan. It's more of a guideline, but at least I know what to point towards. And then getting into grad school, I realized, okay, that is really difficult because things are changing so rapidly. Yeah. So my time frame has been reduced to like 3-month planning. So I can tell you what I'm doing in the next 3 months, but I probably cannot tell you what I'm doing in the next year.
Okay. So what are you doing in the next 3 months? Or how, let me ask it in a more specific way. How is what you're doing in the next 3 months a reflection or a result of what you've spent the last year doing that you probably couldn't have done, before that?
Right. So I will be a fellow at the Internet Archive for the next 3 months. Yeah. My role will be twofold: art directing and organizing creative uses for the Decentralized Web Summit, which is in late summer.
That's so interesting.
So it's incredibly related.
Yeah.
Even if during my first year I was focusing on digital archives, a lot of these new systems have archiving embedded in them. Like if you think of DAT, you can choose to always archive these web pages. Right. Show the history. And more so, it's based on a network of people. It kind of evades this third party that has to be the transmitter between or connecting two people. Yeah. It gives you ownership over your work. It kind of reverts the web to its origins of like optimism and this utopic idea that it's like this Wild West where you could do whatever you wanted. Whereas now it seems like you can only do what you want from like these 5 platforms.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see like what emerges from this summit.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm just like really, this might sound weird to say, but I'm just like very happy for you because like I remember like the first time we met and you were talking about the Internet Archive and archives and that these were this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about side projects. These were things you were doing in your free time, and now you've kind of created this practice for yourself where those things that were the thing that you were kind of just doing for yourself is now like the thing that you're doing. Was that a goal? Were you kind of trying to do that?
I think that's always the intent, that when you go into a program like this, you'll emerge as a new person. Yeah. Maybe that's too idealistic. Even if grad school doesn't answer all the questions you have. If anything, it just adds more.
Yeah.
It does completely change your worldview. Like, you're just meeting so many people that you wouldn't have if you were in the same studio that you had been in.
Yeah.
You're literally just meeting more people. That's really what school feels like. In terms of archiving specifically, and even this fellowship, up to a month ago, I didn't know what I would be doing for the summer, but these opportunities just come naturally. So it's been an exercise for me to really learn to improvise, learn to commit, and or I guess think of short-term commitments rather than trying to like overplan everything.
How has, archives are very important in your work. I think research is very important in your work. How do those things, I don't know the verb that I'm trying to use, how do they either kind of filter into your design practice or influence your design practice, or maybe design practice isn't the right word, maybe to like the form part, like how is maybe form and kind of these research subjects connect for you?
I think it gives you more agency to make the projects you want to see in the world. To go back to Eros Rogoff, she talks about teaching as the shift from inherited knowledge to talking about conditions and responding to those conditions. So with all of these design projects, nothing is this original idea. It's always a response or like a tangent of something else. So if we can use this existing form, bring in new conditions, bring in new perspectives, and it will naturally emerge as like this newer modified version, and hopefully that version is better.
It's like there's that Bruno Latour essay where he talks about how like every design should really be called a redesign. Like everything is just a redesign of the thing that came before. That's interesting. That's an interesting connection. I haven't made that connection in that way before.
I was actually just thinking of Latour because in his book Reassembling the Social,
I haven't read that one yet.
It's basically an introduction to actor network theory. And he says we should redefine what sociology means. Instead of it being the study of the social, it should be the study of associations. So I think more than anything, even if I thought it would be about digital archives, it's just become more about networks and connections. And how like research, projects, education, all of these things just connect. Obviously with a lot of collaborators as well.
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about kind of both being kind of in the profession, but also being able to critique it in a way. What, from your vantage point and from the work that you're doing and the people that you're kind of collaborating with right now, looking at the design profession, what are the things that are that you think designers should be talking about or thinking about, or that kind of critical, deserve a critical lens right now?
I think positioning is a huge topic that should be explained more in undergraduate, especially for students who are basically Gen Z and grew up with the internet. Positioning as in, how do you present yourself online?
Oh, interesting.
It's such a sculpted view of how you are perceived. It's like this weird ethnography, and like there's all these different social constructs and these different ways of talking online and distributing or presenting yourself online. So positioning, then, is how do you actively present what you're doing? That involves, like, being careful about what you say, understanding that, like, in order to get a response from someone, maybe online correspondence in a public setting is not the best place to do that.
Right. That's so interesting. I've asked this question to 80-something people, and that's actually not something that anyone's ever brought up before. But as soon as you kind of described it, I think you're exactly right, both from the way that you're talking about it, but also in just kind of what kind of person do you want to be in the world.
Sure, exactly.
And I'm thinking about when I finished undergrad, I didn't have any tools or language or even like way to formulate what type of practitioner I wanted to be. I just wanted to have a job. And I didn't know that there were all these different types of jobs. I think kind of, Yeah, being able to like put language around that, and again, I guess this comes back to networks and connections again too. It's kind of like how you relate to everyone else is actually that's really interesting.
Maybe it also comes back to fearlessness.
Yeah.
Maybe because now I am more cognizant of how these things stay online forever.
Yeah.
I want to be careful about the things I put online and make sure, like, hopefully a lot of these things are meaningful and not just contributing to this weird echo chamber of passive consumption.
Yeah. My last question, and throughout this whole conversation, you've mentioned people and books that have kind of influenced you, but I'm always interested in kind of who are the writers, the theorists, critics, thinkers, or the books that have really shaped how you think about basically all this stuff that we've been talking about. Or to put it in another way, someone listening to this really interested in what you're talking about, what's the reading list that you give them to kind of dig deeper on these things?
I guess to reiterate the people that I've mentioned, it could be Ira Rogoff. She wrote an essay about a decade ago for eFlux called Turning, about this educational turn in curating.
Yeah.
It could also be, or again, Bruno Latour's Reassembling the Social. The Cybernetics Library, there recently was a Cybernetics conference in October. If you go to cybernetics.social/library, they have a large reading list. I'm also currently reading Broadband, which is Claire Evans' new book. I think Right, I think it's the tagline is The Untold Story of the Women Who Built the Internet.
Yeah, I listened to an interview with her just the other day.
She actually has a great mini talk on the Walker site talking about sci-fi. It's like 10 minutes. I think that, are there more? I'm sure there are so many more. I should have written them down.
Yeah, this is one of those questions that I'm trying to get better at warning people before I ask it so you can think about it, because everyone that I ask is like, I have lines of bookshelves in my office and I can't think of one right now.
Yeah, when it's on the spot suddenly, it does make you think about how we remember content now. It's like through bookmarks.
Yeah.
An institutional reference is the Free Thought Collective, also by Ira Rogoff.
I don't know what that is.
It's like this European Union where they're trying to redefine this educational model. There's no reason to think that education should be curricular. So how can we create a model where you bring in a lot of different practitioners, you're all working towards a shared goal, but it's less delineated, it's less regimented, it's less structured.
Yeah.
I actually quite like structure, but again, I think it's about challenging yourself to see this different perspective.
Yeah.
And again, project-based research, how different projects can lead to a larger research idea.
I love that. I thought that was great. Like I said, minutes ago, I've very much enjoyed watching your career evolve and watching you kind of expand into these kind of other areas, and it all feels like a very natural progression. Each thing kind of makes sense after the other thing. I'm just like very happy with kind of like what you're doing right now and like the way you've built your career. And so I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation and kind of talk about all this stuff, because I think it's really interesting. I just kind of like really admire and like the way you think about all these things. So thank you so much for
having me. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
This episode was recorded on May 18th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.